In the last webinar, we kind of talked about how to read Ruby code. Again, we covered so much there that it's not so much that you have to memorize or remember everything we talked about. It's just being sort of at a high level aware that in the Ruby language, there is a lot of quote-unquote syntactical sugar. And it's very deceptive. When you see one equal sign there, most of the time you can think that that's assignment. In Ruby, that's not always 100% true, because sometimes it's a method invocation, and you're not sure. You just have to be really, really aware. And sometimes it's a variable initialization, and sometimes it's a variable reassignment. Because Ruby, from a philosophical standpoint, doesn't have a lot of keywords, doesn't have a lot of metadata in the code to give us an indication of what it's doing, right? So we have to be really, really aware. And the syntactical sugar philosophy, it goes beyond just the single equal sign, right? It goes to just bare words. Like if you see ARR, although here you can see that it's initialized, but depending on some code up here, you don't know what this is. Is this a reassignment? Is this initialization? Or if we were to just do this, let's suppose we had a lot of code before this, and we had this type of code. ARR could be a local variable, or it could be a method invocation. So the syntactical sugar makes Ruby very difficult to read. It makes it easy to read for sort of non-programmers, if you will. Like if we show this to somebody who has no programming ability, they'll be like, oh yeah, I can sort of read this. It kind of reads like natural English. What a beautiful language. But as developers, it's almost detrimental to our ability to understand exactly what the code is doing because of the imprecision and vagueness of the syntax. The other thing we talked about was where the code comes from. And last time we talked about all the sort of various ways. We didn't even talk about the advanced ways like metaprogramming and things like that, but there's all these different ways that code can be injected into the current execution context depending on what's happening, right? So just knowing the fact that there's this thing called, when we're writing code just sort of out in space here, we're inside like a main context, which automatically gives us a lot of the methods in the standard library. Mix in the kernel module, things like that. We can have puts here being a method, where that come from. When you get into object-oriented programming, you have to have another sort of layer of understanding there in terms of the inheritance rules of Ruby. And then that helps you navigate when you're working inside of a larger framework where it's loading lots and lots of different external libraries and mixing in lots of different modules. So where is this particular method coming from? So where code is coming from is also very difficult to understand in Ruby. And then we talked a little bit about local variable scope, which is, I would say, one of the major sources of confusion for beginning Rubyists. You can get away with a lack of clarity here and still solve problems and exercises. So there are various websites out there that allow you to drill on exercises, but perhaps they're not Ruby specific, right? Which is fine. You can solve the solution in Ruby, JavaScript, Python. But what happens is, and I've noticed this, is that they accept solutions that take global variables. And as a Ruby developer, we don't want you to use that. We want you to understand the local variable rules. So understanding this is really, really important to being able to read code. I won't talk about this because we talked about last time. We didn't get to talking about pass by reference and pass by value. And that's sort of the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is, again, a major source of confusion for beginning Rubyists. So I'll demonstrate it here. Suppose I had a method, right, that takes some argument. And the question is, if I have a string initialized here, and I then pass in this string to a method, the question is, will this str variable here be modified depending on what's happening to the param here inside a method, right? That's the question. So let me set it up so that I can run the code. And so in this case, we can see that str remained hello, and that's not surprising because inside the method here, nothing happened. But suppose, okay, suppose I did this, right? So think about that. This should generate an error because str doesn't exist within this method. str is initialized in a different scope than the method. Methods create their own scope. All right, so I'm just going to run through various permutations of different code, and we can sort of guess the result. If I do param plus equals world, what is going to happen is the a method invocation on line 6 is going to return a new string object, and it is going to have no effect on str. Okay, so this line on line 2 is going to return a new string object. Right, str is unmodified. However, if I do this, then on line 8, str is going to be modified. Right? And so the distinction is, I'm going to show sort of 3 different possibilities here. All right. So the first 2 are not going to have a permanent effect on str. The first 2 are not going to have a permanent effect on str. The 4th line will. The way that you want to read this code is that this code is reassignment. This code is reassignment. Line 3 is string concatenation. String concatenation is what we call a non-destructive action in that it returns a brand new object. And if you want to go even deeper, it's that this looks like an operator, right? It looks like a pretty generic operator in that we can say 1 plus 1 is 2, high plus there is high there. In actuality, this is a method. This is a method, right? In actuality, you can almost think of it like this, right? But again, because of this syntactical sugar of Ruby, we can sort of use it like an operator. So it looks like this. Makes it really hard to read, right? So you can even almost ask yourself, how come that is not a destructive method? And that's just the implementation of the plus method. So the idea the thing to remember here is that there are certain, and by the way, this thing here, the shovel operator or the left shift operator, that's also a method call, right? So the thing to remember here is that when there's a method that is destructive, that mutates the calling object, then you'll see that change out here too. But I'm going to comment out line 2 for now. Right? The difference between line 3 and line 4 is that the plus method call, it's a method call. Looks like an operator, but it's a method call. The plus method call right now is not a method that mutates the calling object, which is param. The left shift or shovel operator or method call is a destructive method. It mutates that object. Right? That's the thing that requires a little bit of memorization. So again, I'm going to comment out line 4. And if we run this code, I'm going to take a survey here. What do you think line 10 is going to output? I just want to see if anyone's following along. Anybody want to take a guess? Line 10? So the plus here is not going to mutate the param, and therefore it is not going to change. Right, it's going to be hello. It's going to be hello. But I'm going to comment out line 3 here and uncomment line 4. And what about this? Is that going to have a change on str for line 10? Right, it is. It is, because the less than operator here is a destructive method invocation, right? And we can use any destructive method invocation would have that effect. Now, I comment out line 2 on purpose. So let's look at line 2 real quick. It's different from line 3. And a lot of people mix this up. A lot of people mix up these two operations and use it almost interchangeably. They are dramatically different. They are so different, and if you don't understand the difference between these two, sometimes you'll get away with that sort of fuzziness and be okay. Other times, you'll be severely punished for that misunderstanding. I'll give you an example right now. Suppose I'm going to leave line 2 comment out. Let's say we have line 3 and line 4 here, both uncommented. And I'm going to execute this code. Let's take a vote here. What is going to be the output of line 10? What is going to be the output? What do you think the output of line 10 is going to be? Hello world. You know what? Sorry, that's a little... Okay. Of course it's going to be hello world because both of them are the same. That's not tricky at all. Okay. So let's change the word a little bit. Then let's see output on line 10. Because you guys get the point I'm trying to raise, right? Which is, if I run this, it's going to be hello world. Line 3 is seemingly ignored. That operation is seemingly ignored. And it is ignored. It is ignored. Because this operation is a concatenation operation. It's kind of like 1 plus 1, right? You're performing that operation but making no change to param. So this operation, you're not saving it to a new variable. So that concatenation returns a new string. It just goes away. You're not saving it anywhere. It just goes away. So it has no effect in this particular program. Line 4 does have an effect, right? It is a left shift and appending the word into the param object, which affects str, and that's a permanent destructive mutation, and we see that. All right, I'm going to change this code up a little bit. I'm going to comment out line 3, and I'm going to uncomment line 2, just to demonstrate that there's a difference between line 3 and line 2. All right, remember that this line 2 is reassignment here. All right, now let's take a guess. What is going to be the output of line 10? Okay, I got some good. I got some variants and responses here. Some people are saying hello world. Some people are saying hello universe world. Some people are saying hello world universe. No one's saying the right answer. I'm very surprised. Nobody has said the right answer yet. It's a little tricky, this code. It's just hello. It's just hello. So I just want to point out, I got about, I'm just rough guessing here, maybe 15 responses for that last question. Nobody got it right. See how tricky that is. And by the way, we're talking about 5 lines of code here. If you don't understand Ruby at the fundamental level, oh, somebody got it right? I'm sorry, I didn't see that. One person got it right, I guess. But if you can't recognize like these 4 lines of code or 5 lines of code here, and you want to build APIs and microservices, and you want to go to an employer and say, please pay me $80,000, I would like a job. It's like, just take time to learn this. It doesn't take that long, but it takes a little bit of studying, maybe a couple hours, right? So what's happening here is that line 2 is very different from line 3, right? That was the point I was trying to convey. A lot of people use them interchangeably. Sometimes you can get away with that. Other times, like here, you cannot. When we had line 3 uncommented with line 4 working below it, line 3 was discarded, right? We said that the string concatenation operation just kind of, return a new string object and we can ignore it. But on line 2 here, it's actually reassignment. So look at the commented out code on line 2. Param plus world, this, we already saw, returns a new string object. However, it saved it to the param variable, which is reassignment. This is reassignment. This is not initialization. Right? And I'll explain why in a second. We're reassigning param to this new object. Therefore, on line 4, this destructive method call is being performed on this new string object. Nothing to do with this line 7 string object. All right, so I want you to hold on to this thought for 1 second. I'm going to explain this idea of variables as pointers to objects. And this is really important to understand. So we have, what do we have here? We have a local variable initialized to the string, to a string object, right? The object has the value hello. So b equals a. What do we have here now? In this 2 lines of code, what is a good mental model to think about this? Right? Are there 2 variables? Are there 2 objects? Are there 4 objects? Like or are there 3 objects? How many things are alive here that we should be thinking about? What is the right mental model? The mental model that you need to develop to think about this is that variables point to objects. Variables point to objects. Objects are things that actually live in memory. They take up space in memory. Okay? This is not reassignment. This is not reassignment. This is 2 variable initializations. A is being initialized to the hello. B is being initialized to point to the same object. So right here, right now, there's 2 variables, 1 object. 2 variables, 1 object. I believe there's a diagram here. Let me see if I can pull it up. Okay, so this is great. It's even using the same variable names here. So a equals hi there is variable initialization. In this worldview, the mental model is there's 1 variable pointing to 1 object, a string object. B equals a, you have 2 variables pointing to 1 object. And then after, if we say a equals not here, this is reassignment. Reassignment, think about what that word means. Reassignment. You're reassigning a to point to a different object. Right? A is now pointing to not here, B is now pointing to hi there. Now, this concept needs to be combined with the concept of destructive method calls. All right? So if I say B, so let me, what is going to be the output on lines 18 and 19 here? Remember, the left shift operator, or the shovel operator, is a destructive call. It's a destructive call. Destructive call means that an operation performed on A is going to go into the object and modify the value of the object. That's what destructive call means. It's not returning a brand new object. It's going to be hello world twice. A is going to be hello world, B is going to be hello world. This is a really, really critical and important mental model that you have to develop to understand not just Ruby, but languages at this, most application development languages. Very, very important. Right, and by the way, we have like 3 lines of code here. Right, so it's not the complexity in terms of the, lots and lots of code, and it's hard to think about. This is just developing a mental model of how programming languages work, at least application development languages, like Ruby. Now I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. All right. Again, thinking about variables as pointers, what's going to be output on lines 24 and 25? I want to see some guesses here, and then I will explain it. Okay, wow, I'm getting responses all over the map here. I would say a handful of people got it right. So, line 21 is reassignment. It's reassigning A away from the object that it was previously pointed at. So let me just say here, at this point, if we were to take inventory, we have 2 variables, 1 object. Okay? At this point, on line 18. And so any mutations or destructive calls to either A or B is being performed on the same object. So right now the world looks like this. A and B point to the string object. A and B point to the same object. Any destructive calls on A or B is going to go into this object and modify its value. It's the same object. A and B are both going to see it. When you inspect A or B, it's just going to go retrieve the value from this object and display it, right? So no matter what destructive calls I make on A or B, it's as if I'm making it on the same object. So when I go and print out A and B, it's going to be identical. Both of these variables are pointing to the same object, so they're going to be identical. After line 23 executes, the world changed, right? The world changed. We have a new string object that came to life on line 23. This string object. It happens to have a value of hey. A is now pointing to that hey. B is still pointing to hello world, the object that contains hello world. Really important to, and again, Ruby doesn't help us, right? Some other languages will give you some sort of indication, but Ruby is just, it's very subtle, right? And by the way, this is even obvious. What if I did this? Same thing. Remember the plus operator or method? It returns a new string object. This is why when we read Ruby docs, it's so critically important to understand whether or not it's returning something new back, a new object back, whether it's a new integer, a new string, a new array, whatever it is. If it says new, light bulbs have to go off. Because if you write this code, right, and by the way, this code is a shortcut for, or there's a shortcut for it. You see how cryptic that is? That's so deceptive, right? You can slide that little bit of code into some larger code and boom, your world changed. Right? This is reassignment, line 23. By the way, do you guys see what this is? This is basically 2 hello worlds, right? For A is now 2 hello worlds, but it is a new object. That's the key. It almost doesn't matter what the value is, right? It almost doesn't matter what the object contains. The only thing that matters is that it's a new object. So now you're in a world where your 2 variables are pointing to 2 different objects. And so manipulation, in other words, destructive calls, on one of those variables is not going to impact the other. But in this world, before line 18, it does matter. Okay, so let me just take a step back. If this is over your head, no fear. Don't worry. Digest it. Let it wash over you. As you learn to code, as you learn the syntax of Ruby, as you move forward, just remember these are actually critical things. Glossing over them is fine. You'll pay for it in the long run, right? There's a lot of Rails developers who don't take time to sort of learn this. This is what I always say. There are shortcuts. There are shortcuts. You can get a job by learning a little bit of Rails, but they're called shortcuts for a reason. There's a benefit and there's a cost. That's what a shortcut is. No benefit, it's a dead end, right? If there's no cost, no consequence, then it's just the right way to learn. Don't worry if sort of this seems daunting for now. It's daunting for a lot of people. But as programmers, let me put it this way, as engineers in training, as programmers in training, I want to encourage you to walk towards ambiguity, not away. If you say, oh, this is confusing, a scientific mindset should be to let me sort it out, not let me not do this and go do Rails, or let me go do something easier, or let me walk away from it, right? So I have some comments in here right now saying this is too hard or I don't get it. I think it's okay to not get it. But the reaction, how you react to this, I think is most important. If you're going to say, I don't get it and I don't want to get it, that's fine, right? Launch school is not for you. If your reaction is, I don't get it, but I'm going to go dig into it and play around with some code. And look at this. Look at how many lines of code we're writing here. Not that many. You can actually dive into a topic pretty deeply with just a few lines of code. So I want to encourage you to kind of walk towards fuzziness and write a little bit of code to clear up the edge cases. That's sort of scientific mindset, a programming mindset, an engineering mindset, right? As opposed to sort of shying away from it. And as if you're already in launch school, you already know this. But if you're not in launch school yet, you'll see that other people in launch school are like that, right? And so they're your colleagues in launch school. They're going to be your competitors when you apply for the best jobs. Need to read about it, definitely. I don't expect you to. The goal here isn't to sort of show you once and you got it. The goal here is to show you how much depth there is in a little bit of code. And by the way, we're taking a tangent here. We got to come back to this in a second, right? The goal here is to show you the concept of variables as pointers and how important it is to have that mental model. Otherwise, it's so hard to decipher and read code. It's just difficult, right? And if you were to meet somebody on the street and they don't know this and they say they're a programmer, you can sort of give them a little bit of side eye and go, well, I don't, how good of a programmer are you, right? And vice versa, right? So make sure to play around with this. So the idea of variables as pointers is critical. I'm going to comment this part out now and go back to our example. All right, why did I sort of go off on this tangent of explaining variables as pointers? Variables as pointers, if you read this section, is pretty easy to understand. Combining with the concept of destructive method calls makes this really, really powerful. Oh, I got a suggestion here. It might help if you show us what a Ruby doc say about the left shift as opposed to plus equals. Okay, that's a good idea. Thanks for the suggestion. First of all, plus equals is not a thing, right? It's reassignment. That's just reassignment. So it's really the plus, right? It's this thing. Plus equals is this. So it's plus versus the shovel. All right, so let me go to the string, because we're working with strings here. Remember I told you these are all methods. They're not like generic operators. So let's first look at this one. String. All right, it's here. So reading docs, if you've never read it before, it's kind of weird. There's a section in our book in the very beginning stages that kind of walks you through how to read it, but the hash here is really instance methods, and the 2 colons are class methods. So as I said earlier, this is a method, right? It looks like not a method, but it is a method. Reading the docs here is a little confusing, I agree. Now, the key thing to look at is this arrow. This arrow means new object. As crazy as that sounds, right? This arrow means, oh, I'm sorry, this arrow means if the variable here to the right of the arrow is different than str, then it's a new object. In this case, it's showing that this operation returns str, which is the calling object. So this is a call that is destructive or mutates. So that's a very good suggestion, and I know reading the docs can be a little bit weird. So append, right? This is the append, or I guess they call this append, concatenates the object to str, right? And that's it. Wow, this is very, very poorly explained. Anyway, the arrow and str means that this is a method that mutates this object because it's returning the same thing. So let's contrast that with plus. Right? You see that? This description is a little better. It says returns a new string, right? And you can see the variable after the arrow is new str, which is different from str, which means that it returns a new string. Seemingly do the same thing, but the return value is critical to understanding this idea of, when combined with this idea of variables pointers, it's critical to understanding code. Otherwise, you get in a situation where you just can't debug it because there's a mismatch of your mental model with how Ruby works. And if there's a mismatch, you don't stand a chance at debugging it. And this is when people start to rely on hack and slash. And this is where people go, you know what, screw it, I'm going to use global variables because you don't understand. Right? I don't understand what's going on. I'm going to use global variables to get through this exercise. Again, that's a little bit of a shortcut too, right? Short-term benefit, you get through the exercise. Long-term cost, you never dug in to really understand what's happening. Okay, so let's take our understanding of variables as pointers, combined with destructive calls to analyze this code. On line 8, we're passing str to a method. Param is assigned to str at this point. You can almost read this line as this. Line 1 is where the param method local variable is initialized. Therefore, line 2, I'm going to align these so that you can see, you can sort of read it this way. On line 2, it's reassignment, right? It's reassignment. And it almost doesn't matter what this code is because it's a new string. Or for the purposes of our analysis here, it almost doesn't matter. The value doesn't matter, right? So this is reassignment. This is like this, line 23. That's reassignment. And again, for the purposes of this particular analysis, it doesn't matter what the value is. It could be a equals high, right? As soon as you see this reassignment, this new variable sprung to life with this code, the plus operator here, new variable. Remember the docs, new string? It's very subtle, but there's a new object that's springing to life at this point. And so what's happening here is that str, param is no longer pointing to the same object as str. Therefore, after this reassignment, we can do whatever we want to param. It's not going to affect the object that str is pointing to. Why do you call it a destructive method? Definitely have to go through the Ruby book again. The person who asked this, it's explained many, many times throughout here, what mutating the caller means? This is a destructive method. It affects the caller, right? It doesn't return a new object. It returns the same object, the object that called the method, but modified in some way. That's what destructive means. But definitely review the Ruby book for that. Huge difference between methods that don't mutate the caller versus ones that do. Mutate the caller is aka destructive. So param is no longer pointing to str exactly. After line 2 is executed, param is no longer pointing to str, so we do whatever we want to param. The only thing that can be affected at that point is the return value of a method, which we don't care about here, right? We're not saving the return value of a method. We're just only looking at the side effect of the argument being passed into a method. This is why line 2 and 3 are completely different. One is reassignment, one is not. People who don't pick up on that little distinction there, and I would say most people don't, is completely missing a critical aspect of how Ruby works. And programming, this is why programming, lawyers do really well as programmers. And I think part of the reason is because they are fanatical about the meaning of every single word in a very, very large legal document. And same thing with code. You might say, well, yeah, that equal sign there, it'll work if it's there, it'll work if it's not there. It seems to just do some concatenation and, I'll just let that go. The habit you need to sort of develop is look at that and go, how come? How come that's different? How come one, there's two syntax, are they really the same thing? Let me go look into that. If you develop that habit, that's going to carry you much, much farther in your programming journey. This is just one example where sort of letting the fuzziness or, not walking towards fuzziness will bite you. On line 2, why does it end with world? Yeah, it's universe, sorry. Okay, let me just, I'm looking at the time. I'm also looking at what we should talk about next. I think this is, okay, one other thing I'll talk about that's related to this code snippet that we're analyzing here is the concept of return value of a method versus side effects. So in this particular method, all right, I'm gonna just delete this all. Let's call this append. Append name puts name. Or let's call it prefix. So the idea here is that we're going to give this name a prefix. All right. Let me just see how well you guys retain this. Is this going to work for this code? Yeah, suppose we wanted to give a prefix. Right, we have a method called prefix. It's going to prepend Mr. to whatever string you pass into it. It's going to prepend that. And we call it this way. That won't work, right? And why will it not work? Well, we know earlier. Because plus, as specified in the Ruby docs, returns a new string. And here, we're not capturing that return value, we're doing something else. So there's a couple fixes to this. Can you guys, suppose we can change the method implementation or change the code on lines 5 through 8. Right? There's two fixes, two ways to fix it. Can you guys propose? Right, exactly. Capture the return value. So we can do this. This is reassignment of name based upon the return value of the prefix method. Or if we want to change the method implementation, we can make that operation a destructive one, and therefore str will be changed. Which one should we do? If suppose we have the ability to change the method as well as the code that is invoking the method, which one should we do? How should we organize the code? The answer is it depends. It depends on where else you want to use this method and whether it makes sense for this method to have side effects. This type of code is extremely dangerous because you're mutating an object permanently. There are certain languages that will never allow you to make permanent changes to objects that you pass in. In that world, it is so much easier to reason about code. When you read code, let's say somebody else wrote prefix. Somebody else wrote it. You can only use it. If you were to look at lines 5 through 8, do you have any idea whether or not this is going to work? You have no idea if this is going to work or not. If somebody else wrote it, and you didn't see the implementation, that is. You have to rely on documentation. You have to rely on the documentation of the prefix method to see what's happening. If you're going to write a method like this, you can help yourself by adding an exclamation mark. It sort of is a convention that a lot of people use to signify that, hey, this method is going to do something. It's going to do something destructive. It's going to go off and perform some sort of change to some object. Probably the argument you're passing to it, but it could be some other thing too, right? Something destructive is going to happen here. I think in general, it's easier to reason about code if you sort of do this. A little bit easier to kind of look at, right? In this way, I don't have to even remember what's happening with this method. And I can sort of guess that this is returning a value that I'm going to use. So this is a much easier way to code. Now, what I would strongly suggest you not do is have a method that you are looking at the return value of, and you're performing some side effects. So for example, let's say you have this code and everything looks great, and then somebody goes, let's go ahead and add something else. There's a new requirement. I don't know, you have to add a suffix or something. Let's say you have to add a date. I can't think of something that would make sense for this method, but let's say you have to add a date to this, right? And you say date. Okay, maybe I'll just, I don't know, something like that. All right, you guys get the point. I'm running out of time here. Suppose there's new, obviously I didn't give too much thought to this, but suppose you add a date. There's a new requirement, you have to add something. Now your method is in order to use your method, you have to be aware that there is a permanent change to your object and you're capturing the return value, right? This is very dangerous because it's quickly sort of getting out of hand in terms of when you make a change to this code, what are you expecting to happen? So the important thing here is to code with intention and be explicit in terms of, are you causing a side effect? Are you causing a change to the argument being passed in? Or does this, in this particular method, do you only care about the return value? Right? So be explicit or be intentional when you code, not just either one of them seem to work. I don't really understand the difference, so let's just pick one. I think maybe in the beginning that's okay, but as you go forward on your journey, I don't want to cause too much analysis paralysis early too, because there's a certain amount of joy that's required when you code, and it's hard to get that joy when you're constantly, being paranoid perhaps about doing it quote unquote right. Makes sense? So in the early stages of your programming journey, I think it's important to have a little bit of fun and just get some simple program running, and that's exciting. As you start to take it more seriously, as you start to have a goal of asking somebody for $80,000, which is get a job, right? As you start to have a goal of getting a job, that's when it's time to kind of buckle down and sort of understand the nuances of the language. And by the way, this is all the basic stuff, right? Some of the basic stuff we're going to go down this list here over time. All right. I'll take a few minutes here for questions. I think this is as far as I want to go. So we talked about today variables as pointers, really important. How the concept of variables as pointers is used everywhere, including when you're passing in an argument to a method. And it's especially tricky when you're combining that concept with destructive method calls and trying to determine if the method that you're invoking is going to have a permanent change to the argument that you passed in, right? You're trying to read the code and trying to just determine if there's any side effects to your object that you passed in. That really tests sort of how well you understand that concept. Okay, so I'll take a few minutes for questions here. Let me see. Am I cheating if I just do puts prefix Joe? Well, I don't know what cheating means. Am I cheating? You can do that. That's just taking the return value of prefix. Right? You're saying instead of saving this as name, just do puts here? Sure. How many hours a day do you recommend we study? Is there a point of diminishing returns? This is a good question, and I completely believe that. There are some programs that will say, we'll turn you into a professional program in 12 weeks. You got to come in and work 12 hours a day. I don't know how effective that is. 12 hours a day? This is not moving boxes, right? You can see that I can sit here and lecture all day about these topics. It's not going to sink in for you. If you do nothing more except attend this lecture today, 2 weeks from now, you won't remember a thing. There's no doubt about that. So it requires practice, and it requires a consistent practice over a long period of time for you to sort of have mastery over this content. There's a little bit of depth to it. It's not that hard. I mean, it's not like advanced calculus or anything. There's a little bit of complexity here. It does require a little bit of studying. So, and also your brain, needs rest. That's how it learns, right? You sort of have an intense study session, then you kind of need to give your brain a break. I think 4 to 5 hours of intense studying per day is probably, at least it's, from my experience, it's my max. 4 to 5 hours is a lot. When I say intense studying, I don't mean you sit in front of your computer, because usually, at least when I sit down, the first hour I'm perhaps, cleaning up my inbox, answering emails, checking Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and it takes me a little bit of time to get into it. And then I'm really in the sort of intense study for maybe a couple hours at most, and lately less than a couple hours, maybe an hour before I'm interrupted by something, or before I just need a break. I'm not talking about how many hours you sit in front of the computer. You can sit in front of the computer for 8 hours a day and still not have 1 hour of intense study, right? But 4 to 5 hours of intense study per day and coding is probably, all I could handle personally. So if you're sitting in front of your computer for 12 hours a day, but you're on Facebook half that time, that's not studying. Or if you're on Twitter proclaiming how you love to code, that's not studying. But this is my opinion. I think everyone's different. So it's like, how many hours of sleep do you need per day? I need 8 to 9. That's just less than that, I'm less effective the next day. That's what I found. Other people can get away with 4 and still be, equally productive. So, although there's no cheating per se, the goal is to keep it dry principle of writing a code. The goal is to always keep dry. I wouldn't say that's always true. You got to think about dry as a guideline. All right, and I would say in general, yeah. I think this is why it's hard to have this conversation, because I know early on that it's important to follow rules, like do this, right? Think about writing, learning how to write. If you were to teach somebody how to write an essay, right? Let's say teach like a 5th grader how to write an essay. I think Obviously, learn some grammar, learn proper grammar first before doing anything. Memorize some vocabulary. But you need to put a structure in place. 5-paragraph essay, right? Don't deviate from that. If you read like an advanced essay by advanced writers, nobody does a 5-paragraph essay, right? So there are certain rules that you should follow in the early stages of your programming journey just so you don't have to think about anything else. As you get better, you'll find that those are suggestions, less rigid. So that's why sometimes I have a hard time answering some of these questions, because you might have read an advanced blog article and say, oh, we should always do this. It's like, well, maybe that's true right now, but later on, maybe that's not true. Right, somebody said brain needs to reconfigure during rest. Yeah, I find that I'm much more productive when I get a good night's rest. And also, I seem to learn better too. I don't look at programming in terms of hours, but rather focusing on concepts until I understand it. That's right. And it's so hard for me to give advice on hours. I know everybody's looking for this. And so I try to give some guidance. But everybody's different. I've seen this over and over and over. What I've noticed is people who come from law backgrounds, lawyers. We have a lot of lawyers in our program. We have a lot of philosophy people in our background, people who are in graduate philosophy programs and undergrad philosophy. They do really well. And also music people. And I don't mean people who play guitar on weekends. I mean people with masters in music, from a university or some sort of music conservatory where they have to learn. And I'm not a musician, but I just still see the patterns. And I think there's something to it. There's something to sort of understanding the logic, problem decomposition. Those things seem to come more naturally. If you don't have that background, that's totally okay too. It's just that it probably is going to take a little bit longer because you're going to get stuck at those areas. So if you have a lot of background in formal logic, it's going to help you. If you don't, you're going to have to take longer. So it's hard to prescribe an hour for every, like in general, for everybody. Everybody's very, very different. And so this is why we built our program this way, is that if it takes you a little bit longer, that's completely okay. But the goal is to reach proficiency in these foundations, right? That's the goal. Don't move forward. If you're in a classroom, it's hard to move at your own pace. Everybody's moving forward at the same pace, regardless of how well you understand the material. And I think that's extremely detrimental to the learning process. Why move forward if you don't understand this, right? It's not going to get easier. It's not like this is going to go away. This is the foundations of Ruby. Not just Ruby, but basically any application development, programming language. So no need to move forward. Take your time. How long should your one code be before you change it to multi-line? I think it's up to you. Most Rubyists will say like 80 characters. I shouldn't say most. A lot of Ruby developers say 80 characters. In my opinion, that's a very, very strict interpretation. It's some historical context, like in the old terminal screen it was 80 characters long. We have modern editors nowadays. I don't want to get people to get too caught up on that particular rule, but just think about legibility, right? That's all. Legibility, code legibility, and clarity. Are different scenarios covering these concepts available in the curriculum, or only covered as they appear in the exercises? These are all topics that are pointed out specifically in various assignments, but you'll run into them over and over and over. This is almost like grammar rules. It's like asking, am I going to run into this grammar rule as I learn to write my book? You're going to run into it with every line of code that you write almost. And the only question is, do you recognize it, right? So a lot of people can copy and paste and not even recognize that there are these concepts that they're glossing over. And so it's important to sort of point them out and just say, recognize what's happening here. And don't rush. Everyone's in such a rush. I don't know why. I think there's this eagerness to move forward. And the question is, why? Why do you want to move forward? Well, because I want to build apps. I want to build interesting applications. I want to... if you've taken a look at our curriculum, we don't lack for content. What we've noticed, though, is that people get there and can't follow. They can't follow the instructions. They ask questions that show that they don't understand basic Ruby. So what's the point of getting there so fast, right? It's okay. Take a couple hours and learn this. I'm concerned about spending too much time on any one area. Topic. Should I build foundation as I move through launch school, rely on illustrate? That's an interesting question. I'm concerned about spending too much time on any one topic. I guess the question is why? How much time do you consider too much time? Like if you spent 5 hours studying this topic, is that too much or okay? Right? That's my question. If you spend 2 days on this topic, let's say this topic we just covered today. If you spent 2 days here, is that too much or this is a matter of opinion, right? What about a week? If you spend a week here, would that be too much? Because if you want to be a professional programmer, you're going to run into this 100 times a day in the future. So I find it hard to believe that you can spend too much time on this. Now, what I would advise against is spending too much time on like learning Rails right now. We're learning Angular or reading blog entries on the newest JavaScript framework. That's a waste of time. Studying this is not a waste of time. You can almost not spend too much time on it. I have yet to see anybody spend too much time on this. But I've seen plenty of people spend a lot of time reading blog entries. Does that make sense? Are you afraid of getting too good at programming? Is that the fear? Okay, I'm running out of questions. Happy to field more questions. I got time. But if this is it, then we'll just pause for today. Continue next time. We have more, we're right here. We're right here. We'll talk about collections next time. That's a really, really important topic as well. And then some debugging. And then we can do some exercises and show how to approach solving an exercise, things like that. Oh, I got a new list of questions here. Okay, so someone's saying, I find it useful to move from learning Ruby concepts to something different, like bash commands, because everything goes hand in hand. Yeah. Yep, but this kind of makes me want to focus. Yeah, right. Here's my suggestion. You can never spend too much time on the items on this list. All right, I don't see that. That doesn't happen. This is like saying, I want to be a professional basketball player. Can I dribble too much? What you can be doing too much if you want to be a professional basketball player is like studying zone defense when you can't dribble. Now that's what a lot of people do. They spend their time reading blog entries about the newest frameworks and how to version their API calls, but local variable scope escapes them. Don't do that. That's a waste of time. You can never spend. You guys, NBA fans? Anyone out there? I'm a huge NBA fan. Steph Curry. You guys see his pregame dribble drill? He practices. That's how you get good. You can't dribble too much. You can't shoot too much. You can study random things too much that is like irrelevant to you. All right, I guess that's it. We're winding down now. Obviously, the conversation's going elsewhere. Anyway, I hope this is. I believe this is how launch school is different from a lot of sort of other boot camps. From my perspective, I will say it's so much easier to build a 2-month Rails program, and then off you go. Don't care what happens. We have a lot of boot camp refugees in our program because nobody takes the time to sort of tell people to learn this. And by the way, I'm not asking for 4 years of your life here, right? I'm talking about 4 extra months, perhaps, on mastering topics that's going to be with you for 10, 20 years. This is not going away. This is not changing. This is the basics how Ruby worked since the beginning, 20 years ago. Ruby will change at the edges. And this is not even Ruby. This is like every programming language, right? At this level of abstraction. None of this is going to change. We're at such a foundational level that you don't have to worry about, our local variable rules are going to change in the future. No, they're not, right? Maybe they'll be tweaked, but definitely no changes. So it's okay to spend extra time here and master the fundamentals. And then learning additional stuff will be so much easier, right? So much easier. All right, I can talk about this all day, so I won't preach anymore. But if you guys want to follow up, email me. hello@launchschool.com. Otherwise, hopefully I'll catch most of you next week. All right, have a good one.